Next up for the Launchpad Virtual Mac Admin Meetup, we have the illustrious Chad Lawson presenting the keynote. Chad, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you. Chad is, among many other things, a maker, tinkerer, a mentor, Beagle dad, human husband, but at Rocketman, he is our DevOps engineer with a deep, deep bag of tricks, engineering expertise, scripting guru background. And so Chad will be presenting why Jamf admins should switch to Z Shell or Shell Games. Chad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. I considered, if you've ever seen any of my presentations before, I love to incorporate magic in, and I considered doing, bringing in some bit of shell game magic, but quite frankly, I'm not that talented. So instead, I decided I would open with a story. And for this, we're going to need to set the Wayback Machine to the year 2000, specifically the Internet Wayback Machine. If you've ever played around with that site, what is it, Internet Archive, or but the Wayback Machine, setting it to the year 2000 in a website called Vegas.com. This is spring of 2000. This is the way the web page looked. Spring of 2000. I think it was like March for this particular screenshot. I was getting ready for my third trip to Vegas during close to spring break, and I had this very unsurprisingly nerdy idea. If you look toward the bottom half, you'll see the link for webcams. Well, if you follow over to the webcams page, they had two webcams, one at the Hard Rock Hotel, where you could pan, tilt, and zoom and control a camera to look around the poolside. Needless to say, that one was always being used and somewhat creepy. But the one that I was interested in was the Imperial Palace, which is somewhere right around the middle of the strip. And that particular camera could look out north or south down the strip, look out directly across to Caesar's Palace. But I had this idea in my head by looking at the control page for that camera, that everything I needed to control that camera could be done with a script. I could write a script to control the camera, go to a X, Y, and Z that I knew, take a picture, and using the live postcard feature you see there, send myself that picture. So I got all this set up and ready to go, created the script to control the camera, to parse the resulting HTML, save out the image in question, and then append that to an existing HTML page. So then fast forward a few weeks, and I am standing across the street from the Imperial Palace with a Nextel phone connected through a data link cable to a Palm Pilot Series 5. And with that particular combination, I took an internet selfie. And yes, that is me in 2000. I'm so glad Eric is muted right now. And now you might wonder, okay, this is great and all, and yeah, you did that with scripting, but why is this particular picture relevant to this topic? It's because the shirt that I am wearing states that I am a born-again believer. Yes, I have been bash scripting and somewhat obsessive with this for over 23 years. I bought that shirt in 1998, I believe. And with all that, I am still here telling you it is time for us as Jamf admins to switch to Z Shell. To give you a little bit of history and context for this, we all know that very recently, Apple changed the default shell. There's a number of the different shells available on Mac OS, and until recently, there were also other interpreters like Python and Perl and Ruby. Most of those have gone the way of the dodo. But I thought it might be fun to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane. So starting here with where we are, it's not that far back to get to the point that Apple changed to Z Shell as the default. That was just 10.15 Catalina. Hopefully, since this is recorded, I got both of those right. But if we take and go all the way back to 10.3, that is when Bash first became the default shell. But at the risk of dating myself slightly, I remember a time when from 10.0 to 10.2, or 10.0 through 10.2, TC shell was the default shell. And just as a interesting side note, I was surprised to find out that Bash didn't actually get, I didn't know Bash was added until it became the default shell, but it turns out it was added at 10.1. Yeah, nobody cares. So, okay, great. Why would Apple make this change? If Bash had been the default for all of these years, why would Apple considering changing Bash to Z shell? Well, if you do a looking online, even some of the more reputable sites, there are two main theories. One is shell shock. If you're not familiar with it, shell shock was a series of exploits. It was a vulnerability found in the Bash shell that dated all the way back to version 1 of Bash, somewhere within the 1 series, like 105 or something. I'm making up that number. But it meant that a properly formatted shell message could give the person elevated and take control of a computer. Now, at this particular moment, when shell shock was discovered, every single Mac was potentially vulnerable to it. Now, there were remote exploits and there were local exploits. Like the remote exploit for a Mac required you either having a web server running on your Mac, which very few people did, or having gone into the sharing settings and turned on remote login and enabling guest access for sharing, which I don't know anybody that did. I worked with a lot of schools that like to flip switches and turn everything on, but I never ran into a situation where one of those two conditions was on and that particular IP address was accessible through the internet. But if you may also remember around this time, Gatekeeper wasn't on by default. And so anybody that received a particular junk piece of code from a malicious site could then suddenly have control, either remote control of your machine, or more likely turn your machine into a bot for nefarious purposes. Now, when that came out, Apple had a fix out very quickly. While it was extremely scary in its scope, it didn't affect that many Macs. It didn't in the long run. But a lot of people think that since it was shortly after that Apple made the change, that was the reason. But I think the more credible reason was that Bash 3, the shell that you can still find on your Mac right now, Bash 3 was under the GPL version 2 license, which was very friendly to developers of all shapes and sizes. Bash 4, which is where a lot of the progress has really come, was released under GPL v3, and it was described as extremely corporate hostile. Some of the vaguely written rules made it sound as though if you used any piece of GPL3, then suddenly you had to release all of your code public. There was a particular clause that was described in the media as the anti-Microsoft clause. Even Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, refused to update Linux to GPL3. He felt that it was too restrictive and was counter to what was supposed to be going on. And as we know, Apple does like to keep things at least friendly to themselves, if not 100% open to the world. So I think this is probably the more likely reason that Apple made the switch. They wanted a shell that was in active development and could be incorporated in Mac OS without having to change too many things from a legal standpoint. All right, that's great. Why should Jamf admins switch? Well, I mean, if you look at everything going on in Z shell and the way it has taken off in the last few years, there's all this particular stuff going on for it. But let's just take a look at Z shell on my Mac as it stands when I developed these slides was running 5.8.1. The latest release that is out on the internet is 5.9. So that puts us pretty up to date with when Ventura came out. Z Shell was the most recent version. To contrast that, Bash, the version on my computer, 3.257, the last one under GPL 2. Whereas the latest release is now 5.2, two whole major releases forward. And a lot of what I'm going to be showing you today in Z Shell, these enhancements and the reasons I think it's worth making the upgrade, do exist within Bash 4 and 5. Now, you could simply update your computers to Bash 4 or 5, but the reason I'm talking about this from a standpoint of why would Jamf admins want to make this change is what we're doing is we're not just sitting in front of each and every single one of our computers and running at the terminal. We're running typically policy-driven shell scripts, and we want to make sure that these scripts that we write will run on every single computer we need to manage. And just by the way, in case you're thinking, well, that's fine. Of course, Apple's not going to keep Bash up to date. It's no longer their default shell. Why would they care about anything that's not their default shell? The version of TC shell that is on my computer is as up to date as was when Ventura released. So Apple is still even keeping TC shell up to date. So just to kind of give you a hint that, yeah, Bash is not getting brought up anytime soon. Well, okay, great. Why would I care? But if you look at everything that's going on in the Z Shell community, there's all of this particular information. There's right. I came here not to talk about all the why Z Shell is pretty and wonderful and magnificent as a day-to-day shell, but why should Jamf admins change? Well, I really have two main tricks up my sleeve, if you will. First and foremost, we now have real arrays. If you've ever done any sort of array, attempting to create like a list of things within a shell script, you know that it can be a little difficult to fight at times. So instead of just having to have some internal field separator trick going on, no, we have real arrays in Z Shell, the Z Shell that we have on our Macs right now. To show you what I'm talking about, I was trying to find a particular block of code that I had within one of our scripts to show this, but I came up with the realization putting these slides together. I have been so frustrated with trying to force strings into arrays within Bash that I have completely done away with the practice. So I don't have a lot of real world examples of this. But here's an example that I was able to kind of cobble together. I think it's pretty representative. You pull information from some source and you assign it to a variable, whether that be pulling down a list of buildings and departments from the API and putting it into a list that I can then display. Sometimes any particular line, any particular element within the array has one word. Sometimes it has more than one word. How do you separate out each particular element? Bash, by default, its internal field separator is white space. So running this code as it is, you wind up with a mess like this. Each word, not each line, each word becomes its own line. And that's not what I want. Whereas I want to show a comparable bit of code in Z Shell. You'll notice at the top, I've changed my shebang line, but the main change here is this line here, line 10. I am recasting my string as an array. The outer parentheses you see are what tell Z Shell interpret this as an array. And the inner parenthesis, the F, that F is a variable flag that tells Z Shell to interpret this based on specifically using white space, using line ends. So either a new line, a carriage return, or both. And so now when I run this code, I get the expected output I want. And this, I've been in the process over the last couple of months since Ventura came out of taking a look at all of our main scripts and how well do they fare in Ventura to make sure that they're all compatible. And while I haven't run into any particular problems, I have started moving things to Z shell, and this right here has opened up so many possibilities. I have completely gone away from some of the easier tricks that I've had up my sleeve because I could never quite get arrays working the way I wanted. Now it's, as you see, ridiculously easy. Another particular trick is what's called an associative array, sometimes known as a hash or a dictionary. But it's the idea of having, if I create an array to define a person, I might use the key value pair of name, Chad, hair, spiky, age, and I could now then say that the variable person has the key value pair of name and Chad. Well, I don't have that in Bash 3. I do have it in Bash 4, but I don't have Bash 4 on my Macs, and I'm not about to push Bash 4 out to all my computers just so I can use this feature when I already have a tool. I have Z shell that is the default shell on my Mac, and I can already do what I want. So here's a block of code from one of our scripts that I've recently given an overhaul. And you can see throughout this section exists toward the top, and I'm just grabbing all of that internal input from the Bash, from the Jamf policy parameters, and I'm doing comparisons to, I'm setting a default, comparing it to the value it has there. And I'm a little, as Chris might not say it to my face, but anal in my documentation, so this might be somewhat readable. But let me compare this to doing this with an associative array in Z shell. At a glance, anyone looking at this knows what this is for. They know that this is all of my configuration variables for my script. They know what the defaults are. They know what the key value pairs are. And when I look down the script, you know exactly what this particular variable is for and where it came from. So this is another thing that is changing the way I think about writing Jamf policy scripts, to be able to separate my variables that come from parameters versus my derived variables within my script. All right, so if by any chance I've convinced you that this is something you want to start playing around with, what would you need to do to make this happen? Well, first and foremost, go into your scripts, and at the very top, you'll find the shebang line. Yes, that's what it's called. The hash bang / bin / bash, as it's said on my shirt, and simply change it to Z shell. And for 90% of your shell scripts, this is all you're going to need. In fact, there's only a few places that you're going to run into problems, and it took me a little while to find a particular example of this. I mentioned earlier that I'd kind of given up on using arrays within early Bash because they were unwieldy. Well, Bash takes its cues, both Bash and Z shell derived from the original Born shell. Bash stands for Born Again Shell. They were both within a couple of months. Born shell had become completely stagnant. It wasn't going anywhere, and the Richard Stallman didn't like the progress that's being made, and these two developers came forward to create shells. Well, the Bash shell tends to follow C shell, and specifically the C programming language methodology, which means that if you create an array of n elements, you index the array from 0 to n minus 1. I have 8 elements. I start at 0 and I go up to element 7 as my last element. Well, Z shell comes from the Corn shell and follows some of the other philosophies that are meant to emulate that low-level programming language. They're meant to be more higher-level programming. So, writing the exact same block in Z shell, I start at 1 and I go to the last element. Now, it's one of those little things, but this is what broke when I tried switching over to Z shell. This is the only script, knock wood, this is the only script in my repertoire that broke when I switched from Bash to Z shell. Everything else, as I've been doing tweaks, has just gotten easier. Okay, maybe you're convinced. Maybe you're ready to go on and say, you know what? I'm ready. How can I possibly learn more about this? Well, I'll start with Dr. Google, right? Hit Google, you'll find a lot of good answers. But as usual, for any one of my presentations, I will be putting all this together into a blog post. It isn't finished yet because as you can see, I'm currently on the road, as is the entire Rocket Man team. But I will be putting together notes and putting them into a blog post. So everything you found here and all of the sources from which I have found these answers should be available to you. And I will also put those same resources, once this gets brought up onto YouTube, they'll be in the description. But if you really want to get started right now, if you haven't found the website scriptingosx.com by Armin Briegel, he is a brilliant man, a wonderful presenter. He has presented at Mac Admins. He's presented just this last year at JNUC on interfacing the Jamf API with Swift. And quite frankly, he has a many blog post series on moving over to Z Shell. And I wish I had found his information sooner, both in terms of putting this presentation together, but also in my own exploration of Z Shell, because this isn't hyperbole. Armin literally wrote the book on moving to Z Shell. So if you're looking for a place to start, his book is $9.99. It is only available, that I have found, on Apple Books. But this should give you every tool that you need to begin your migration.